Just a short boat ride from one of the most visited cities on Earth, there's a small island that almost nobody is allowed to set foot on. It sits in the Venetian lagoon, close enough that you could see it from a passing water taxi, and for about 100 years it's been essentially off-limits. Locals in Venice have a quiet rule about it: you don't go there. Fishermen are said to avoid the waters around it, and when people talk about it, they lower their voices a little, the way you do about something you'd rather not think about too hard. This is Poveglia. It gets called things like the most haunted island in the world, and normally I roll my eyes at a phrase like that, but this is one of the rare cases where the reputation isn't really built on ghost stories, it's built on what actually historically happened here. Two very dark chapters stacked on top of each other on one tiny piece of land. So today I want to fly out to it and look at why an island this close to Venice has been left to rot behind a wall of "do not enter," because the real history is heavier than any ghost story someone could invent. Let's place it first. This is Venice, the canals, the tourists, the whole postcard. And out here, in the shallow lagoon that surrounds the city, are dozens of small islands. Some are famous, some are working islands, and some, like this one, have been quietly abandoned. Poveglia is tiny. You could walk the length of it in a few minutes, and for most of its history, it wasn't sinister at all. People lived on it for centuries, going back well over 1,000 years. At various points, it had a small community, a village, ordinary life. But its location turned out to be its curse. It's isolated, but not too isolated. It's separate from the city, but close enough to keep an eye on. And in a place like Venice, a dense, crowded trading port where ships arrived constantly from all over the known world, an island like that becomes very useful for one specific purpose. It becomes the place you send the things you want kept away from everyone else. And that is the role Poveglia ended up playing, twice in 2 different centuries, for 2 different kinds of fear.
The first chapter is disease. Venice, for all its wealth, lived under constant threat of plague. Ships coming into a busy port could carry sickness that would tear through a packed city. So Venice did something that was actually ahead of its time. It used islands in the lagoon to isolate the sick and the suspected sick, keeping them away from the mainland until the danger passed. This is genuinely part of where our modern idea of quarantine comes from. The word itself traces back to this region. Poveglia became tied to that grim system. During outbreaks, this small island is where the sick and the dying were sent. People pulled off ships, people showing symptoms, separated from the healthy and left here, away from the city they were trying to protect. And here's the part that gives the ground itself its reputation. Over the centuries of plague, enormous numbers of the dead were buried in these lagoon islands. Poveglia is one of the places associated with those mass burials. The soil here is, in the most literal sense, layered with history, with people who came to the lagoon and never left it. I want to be careful and honest here, because this is where fact and legend blur. You'll hear wild, specific numbers thrown around, that the island is half made of ash and bone, that tens or hundreds of thousands died right on this spot. Those exact figures aren't something I can verify, and a lot of them are almost certainly exaggerated over time. What's solid is the real thing. This island was part of a system for isolating disease and burying its victims over a very long and very deadly period. That's grim enough without inflating it. But the plague isn't why the buildings you can see up here exist. Those come from the second chapter, and this is the one that really cemented the island's dark name. In the early 20th century, a facility was built on Poveglia and used as a hospital and, according to widely repeated accounts, as a psychiatric asylum. The large building with the tower that still stands here, crumbling, is tied to that era. Now, this is where I have to be straight with you again, because this is the heart of the Cursed Island legend, and it's also where the storytelling runs way ahead of the evidence. The popular version goes like this. A doctor here supposedly performed cruel, primitive experiments on patients. Patients reported seeing the ghosts of the plague dead, and eventually the doctor, tormented, is said to have thrown himself from that very tower. It's a chilling story. It's also exactly the kind of story that grows in the retelling. The hard documentation behind those specific claims is thin. What we can say responsibly is more restrained. There was a hospital and mental institution here in the 20th century, and psychiatric care in that era, in many places around the world, could be genuinely grim by modern standards. The building's decay and its isolation did the rest. Human imagination is very good at filling an empty asylum with screams. So the honest picture is two real heavy layers, a plague-era isolation site and a 20th century institution, plus a thick fog of legend that grew on top of both.
Now, I've been careful this whole time to separate fact from story, but I'd be cheating you if I didn't tell you the stories, because the folklore around Poveglia is a genre all its own. So let me be clear up front. Everything in the next couple of minutes is legend, local whispers, retold tales, the kind of thing that grows in the dark. None of it is documented fact, but it's exactly what people say and why they still won't come here. They say the ground itself is the problem. The story goes that so many plague dead were burned and buried here that the soil is more ash than earth, and that local fishermen for generations have refused to cast their nets too close, because sometimes what comes up isn't fish, bone, they say, fragments, the lagoon giving back what was put into it. Then there's the tower. Visitors who've slipped onto the island illegally, and people do, come back with the same story, almost word for word, a heavy feeling, the sense of being watched from empty windows. Some claim they heard it, a low ringing from the old bell in the tower, even though there's no bell there anymore, and hasn't been for a very long time. A bell, they say, that only the island rings. And the doctor. The legend of the asylum's doctor is the one that refuses to die. The tale says he grew obsessed, that his experiments drove him past the edge, and that in the end the ghosts of the plague dead came for him and he threw himself from that tower. But the story doesn't stop at the fall. The version people love to tell is that he survived the drop, only to be strangled by a mist that rose from the ground, the island itself finishing what the fall started. And ever since, they say, a faint tolling from that tower is him still up there. I'll say it one more time plainly, I can't stand behind a single word of that. It's folklore, not history. But here's what's real, and what I find more unsettling than any ghost. People believe it enough that a prime piece of land, minutes from one of the richest cities in Europe, sits empty. The stories did something the plague and the asylum couldn't. They kept everyone away. And a legend that empties an island for 100 years is in its own way more powerful than a ghost.